The single dad stood in the parking lot at 11 o'clock at night on Christmas Eve, holding a cardboard box with everything from his desk inside it, and he could not stop shaking, not from the cold, but from the question echoing in his head over and over. How am I going to tell my daughter I lost my job on Christmas? 6 years he had given that company. 6 years of early mornings, late nights, missed birthdays he made up for later, and now it ended with a security guard named Miguel walking him out the front door like he was a stranger. Nobody explained why. Nobody looked him in the eye. His supervisor just said, "Corporate decision, effective immediately," and turned back to her computer screen like his life hadn't just collapsed in front of her. The single dad sat in his car for a long time before he could make himself turn the key. His daughter, 7 years old, was waiting at his sister's apartment, probably still awake, probably still believing in the version of her father who always found a way to make things work. He didn't know how he was going to make this one work. There was no version of this where he had an answer. He drove home through streets covered in soft white snow, past houses glowing with string lights, past families laughing behind warm windows, and every single one of those lights felt like a small, quiet insult, like the whole world was celebrating except for him. When he walked into his sister's apartment, his daughter ran to him in her reindeer pajamas, arms wide open, and said, "Daddy, did you bring the tree topper?" And he had to swallow hard before he could smile and say, "Of course I did, baby." He hadn't. He'd forgotten it in the box, along with everything else that used to matter to him at that job. That night, after she fell asleep on the couch waiting for Santa, he sat alone in the dark kitchen and opened his laptop, staring at his bank account, doing math that refused to work out no matter how many times he ran the numbers. Rent was due in 9 days. He had $83 to his name, and somewhere in the back of his mind, a memory kept surfacing, a memory from 3 weeks earlier, the real reason, he suspected, that he had been fired, though nobody had the courage to say it out loud. 3 weeks before Christmas, the single dad noticed something wrong in the shipping department. Packages meant for a children's hospital charity drive were being quietly diverted, mislabeled, and resold through a side channel that led straight back to a regional manager named Gary Holt. The single dad wasn't the type to stay quiet. He gathered the paperwork, the invoices, the shipping logs, and brought it directly to Human Resources, believing, foolishly maybe, that doing the right thing would matter. 2 weeks later, he was called into an office and told his position was being eliminated due to restructuring. Nobody mentioned Gary Holt. Nobody mentioned the report. It was as if the truth had simply been swallowed by the building itself. He tried calling HR the week after, but the number rang and rang, and the woman who finally picked up told him the case had been closed and there was nothing further to discuss. He wanted to fight it, he really did, but a single father with a daughter to feed doesn't always get to choose the battles he can afford. So he swallowed his pride, updated his resume at midnight while his daughter slept, and applied to 11 different warehouse jobs before Christmas Eve even arrived, hearing nothing back from any of them. On Christmas morning, his daughter tore through the little pile of presents he had scraped together, and when she opened the last one, a second-hand tablet he'd fixed up himself, she hugged it to her chest like it was made of gold and said, "This is the best Christmas ever, Daddy." He had to walk into the bathroom and run the water so she wouldn't hear him cry. 2 days later, on December 26th, he was standing in line at the unemployment office when his phone rang, an unknown number, and normally he would have ignored it, but something told him to answer. A woman's voice, calm and careful, introduced herself as an assistant to the company's newly appointed interim CEO, a woman named Diane Castellano, who had been brought in that week after the previous CEO resigned abruptly amid a shareholder investigation. The assistant said Diane wanted to speak with him personally, and could he come in tomorrow morning. The single dad barely slept that night, turning over every possibility in his mind, wondering if this was good news or just another door closing in his face. The next morning he sat in a conference room he used to walk past every day without a second thought, and Diane Castellano walked in holding a manila folder, and she didn't sit down right away, she just looked at him for a long moment and said, "I read your report." The single dad felt his chest tighten. She continued, explaining that when she took over, one of the first things she demanded was a full audit of every termination filed in the last quarter, because the board suspected something was being covered up, and his name came up immediately, attached to a whistleblower complaint that had mysteriously vanished from the official file, except for one copy, buried in a compliance server nobody thought to check. Diane opened the folder and slid it across the table, and inside were the very documents he had submitted weeks earlier, the shipping records, the resale invoices, everything, and she said, "Gary Holt has already been terminated, and the board is pursuing legal action against him for theft from a children's charity." The single dad sat there in stunned silence, his hands trembling slightly on the table, not sure whether to feel vindicated or simply exhausted from carrying this alone for so long. But Diane wasn't finished. She said, "I also want you to know something else," and her voice cracked slightly as she said it. "My son spent 4 months in that same children's hospital 8 years ago, the one those packages were meant for, and if it weren't for people willing to tell the truth even when it costs them everything, kids like him don't get the toys, the comfort items, the small things that make a hospital room feel less frightening." She paused, wiping her eyes quickly, almost embarrassed, and said, "You didn't just lose your job for nothing. You lost it protecting something that mattered more than you probably even realized." The single dad felt something break open in his chest. Not sadness this time, but relief, the kind that comes after holding your breath for far too long. Diane then said something he never expected. She offered him his position back, not just restored but promoted, to a supervisory role overseeing ethics and compliance in the very department where the fraud had happened, because, she said, "We need people who choose to do the right thing even when nobody's watching, and clearly you're one of them." She also quietly arranged for his back pay to be reinstated in full, covering every day since his termination, which meant the rent he'd been terrified of missing was suddenly the least of his worries. The single dad tried to speak, but his throat closed up, and Diane just smiled gently and said, "Take your time." When he finally managed words, all he could say was, "I just wanted to do right by those kids. I wasn't trying to be a hero." Diane shook her head and said, "That's exactly why you are one." Word of what happened spread quietly through the company over the following weeks, not as gossip, but as something closer to reverence. Employees who had grown cynical about corporate promises watching a single father's integrity actually get rewarded instead of punished, and something shifted in that building, a kind of quiet hope people hadn't felt there in years. 3 months later, the single dad stood in that same warehouse, now renovated with a new mission statement painted across the break room wall: "Values before profit," a phrase Diane insisted on after everything that happened. He watched new shipments go out for that same children's hospital, this time tracked, verified, protected, and he thought about his daughter, about the tablet he'd fixed up for her, about how she never once complained that Christmas even though she probably sensed something was wrong. That evening, he picked her up from school and she ran to him the way she always did and asked, "Daddy, are we still doing the tree topper next year?" And he laughed, for the first time in months, and said, "We're doing a lot more than that next year, baby." Because sometimes doing the right thing costs you everything, before it gives you back more than you ever imagined possible. Sometimes the people who seem to have all the power are the ones who forgot what it means to have a heart, until someone reminds them. And sometimes, the truth, even when it's buried, even when it's silenced, even when it costs a father his job on Christmas Eve, finds its way back into the light exactly when it's needed most. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, leave a comment to share your thoughts, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to Wings of Kindness for more inspiring stories. Remember, even the smallest act of kindness can change someone's life forever.